Welcome to another episode of the NeuroMarvels. Dr. Gwen Palafox here with
Dr. Dana Waters. Welcome to the podcast.
Today what we really, I think, maybe Dana, you introduced today, because I think this is,
Sure.
this is something that you've been seeing more and more. You've lived experience with this. You take it away.
Yeah, so today, first of all, I want to recognize that I always feel like a dork doing the introduction, and just to normalize that, because it's like on the fly. Gwen's so much better at it, but I love my awkward, dorky introduction. So, okay, now I've got that bookmarked. Today, we're going to talk about diagnosis, but really focus on self-diagnosis, or maybe talk about the difference between the two, professional diagnosis and self-diagnosis. So self-diagnosis is just like it sounds, right? You read up about and do research on what autism is and see if it fits for you. The interesting thing that when I first thought I might be autistic, I was talking to a student of mine who disclosed to me that he was autistic. So one of the things I did, this student of mine told me about this thing called the Aspie Quiz, before Aspie in and of itself became a word that people aren't fond of. Another podcast. But it's an online thing. If you Google it, Aspie Quiz, it comes up. It doesn't look very official. It looks kind of like a dorky little site, but it'll ask you some preliminary questions, like what your gender is and how old you are, and actually asks you where in the world you live. The reason they keep adding to it, they've gotten, the database is so large, and they've gathered so much data on so many people. Now they can norm it with where you live, put in some cultural nuances and things like that. So you go on there, and I think it's like 160 some questions, asking things that you're like, why are they asking me this? And other things that you might recognize if you've done some research, like I like watching moving water or something, that's sort of stereotypically autistic. And then it gives you a readout. It does give you a 4 or 5 page thing that you can read, but right at the beginning, you'll get this thing that looks like a big spider web, and it'll plot you out on these 8 variables. I think it's 8 variables. I could be wrong on that, where you fall in terms of strength towards neurodiversity or strength towards neurotypical, right? The nice thing, I've gone on there and taken it like every couple of years. It's pretty stable now, but when I first took it, secret at home, right? Because the student had told me about it. I came out looking autistic, and I was like, that's interesting. Kind of banked it away and didn't think about it or tell anybody for like 5 years. And then I kept coming back to the idea of that, did the quiz again, came out the same again. And then I found other tests online that you can take. There's a handful of them that you can, are what we call self-administered, and they score for you, and then they give you a readout. Now, professional diagnosers never just give you one measure or test and then say, oh, you have this, which is why it bugs me when you go to your physician's office and they give you a 30 question thing on depression, and then they say, oh, you're depressed. It's like, it's a little more complex than that. But anyway, so the more of those you can gather and take those and see where you fall out on various things, right? So there's one that looks at social functioning, and one that looks at sensory kinds of things, and so on. So you start to gather this information about yourself. The main tip that I would give you if you're doing those is do them as honestly as you can. So I noticed answering questions on that Aspie quiz the first time I did it, doing a little bit what we call impression management. Like, well, I really feel this way, but that's probably not all right, so I'm going to answer this way. Don't do that, right? If it says, I prefer to be alone or spend time alone than to spend time with friends, and you think to yourself, well, that's not socially acceptable, so I'm going to answer in the middle somewhere, but you really would rather spend time alone, be honest, because it'll give you the best outcome or output for who you really are. And autism diagnosis, a good one, whether it's self-diagnosis or professional, is getting at your internal world rather than what other people see. Now with kids, with professional diagnosis, we do a lot of those collateral sources. We had talked to parents and sometimes even siblings and teachers and things like that, mostly just because little kids aren't good reporters yet of their internal world. But if you're an adult, you're going to be a good reporter. I learned things about myself through doing some of those measures, because I would read something and I go, I never thought about that, but yeah, that's totally me. And so you can take those tests, that and doing research online. There's so much information out there now, including my Awake project that has information, and my book, Bite Size Autism. I'll put a plug in. There's so much accessible information out there now for you to do research on yourself to see if you resonate with it and see if it tends to fit, right? Now, that would be what we call self-diagnosing. I'm pretty sure I keep coming out this way. Every test I take does this. Everything I read, I can relate to. It's not like I'm stretching really hard to relate with it. It must be the case, right? Within the autism community, so within the community of people who are actually autistic, self-diagnosis is just as valid as professional diagnosis. And in some cases, more so, because professionals can be biased and get it wrong. I have a lot of people I've known who have had a professional person talk to them who doesn't know autism, especially in women, and tell them they're not autistic, right? So take all those quizzes, take all that information that you've gathered, and if you're going to get diagnosed professionally, take that with you to give it to them. But within the community, you will be accepted and you will be brought in and loved as one of us, even if it's self-diagnosis. And like I said, we give a little bit more credibility to that because you know yourself better than anybody else, right? If you've done things to explore your own inner world and really reported to yourself accurately, you're going to get it right, right? Professional diagnosis would be like coming to me or Gwen, and we would give you, maybe we give you some of those online measures, maybe we give you some other ones. And then we also do what we call a clinical interview, which would be to ask you a lot of questions about things that we know are related to autism to see if they're there and so on. And then do that collaborative with you to come to that place. Now, why would you want to get professional diagnosis if within the community, it's just as valid to have a self-diagnosis? Well, if you're in school, and you're like your video that you've just released, Gwen, on what is an IEP, if you need a learning plan at school, or you're trying to get accommodation through your employer, or you're trying to get disability benefits, let's say, those have to be done through someone like me or Gwen. They have to be done through someone who's licensed to do that. They're not going to take a self-diagnosis. And that's the big difference. So when people reach out to me and they say, I want to come to you to get diagnosed, the very first question I ask is, what are you going to use the diagnosis for? I just want to know. And I'll say, well, you don't need all this expensive stuff to get that diagnosis, and then I'll work with them and do a completely clinical diagnosing with them doing the online measures. Because if you go to someone cold call for a full diagnosis, as those assessments can be thousands of dollars. Depending on what country you live in, you can be on a 3-year waiting list. I have friends in England that I know online still waiting. It was a major happy day, the day they got approved to be in the queue. And then the wait is 2 to 3 years to get assessed by someone. And then they have to wait and see if the assessment is going to go well, which comes to so professional diagnosis, self-diagnosis, and then the other really big important tip, if you're going to get professionally diagnosed, do not mask. Answer all those questions as honestly as you can and be yourself. If you're meeting with a professional and you're nervous and you're shaking your foot and you're thinking, oh, I shouldn't do that. No, if that's something you normally do it, right? Don't do that impression management thing. Just give them as honest answers as you can. And then hopefully they'll pick up on that. They can't measure or comment on something that they don't see or get data for. So you really want to it sounds terrible, but you kind of want to put your worst foot forward. but really be your most authentic autistic self with the assessor so they can get an accurate picture of you, right? About what it's like and what you go up against when you're not masking, right? So
Yeah.
that's my kind of spiel around um, self-diagnosis versus professional diagnosis, and really want to encourage people that self-diagnosis is just as valid in the community. But then there's also reasons people might want to seek professional diagnosis. I didn't go through the whole process of professional diagnoses because I'm a psychologist. I could meet with someone who I knew who was a psychologist, and we went over everything together. And she reaffirmed my own diagnosis, and
Mhm.
said, "Yeah, I don't think you're wrong. Absolutely, I would have diagnosed you as that." So it really depends on where you're coming at it from, whether you're a kid or an adult, and really what you want to use it for. Some family members won't, this is terrible, right? Some family members won't see it as valid unless you have a professional say yes. I have had clients be diagnosed by me and then be able to tell their spouses or families that a doctor diagnosed them, and then their families finally like, okay. And I'm happy to help, but it's kind of crappy that that had happened, right? But if you go online and you start joining groups or talking to other people online who are autistic, they'll give you lots of tips on how to self-diagnose as well. And the wonderful thing is I've met nothing but welcomeness from the community in terms of me. I think I might be, and everybody's like, oh yeah, okay, what do you need? How can we help? And this helped me or that helped me, and that kind of thing. You'll find wonderful kinship with people online with those things if you can find some groups along those lines.
Which I think is so important. I think everyone
Mm-hmm.
wants to find a sense of belonging somewhere.
Oh yeah,
That's so
yeah.
important, I think, just as a human. I really like
Mm-hmm.
this kind of highlight, Dana, on, labels are only important when they serve a purpose, a specific
Mm.
purpose or function.
Yeah.
Why do you need this? Yeah, you do
Mm-hmm.
need it to navigate funding and supports and
Yeah.
services. You do.
Yeah.
If you're not paying for it out of pocket, that is critical and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
necessary. That's a gatekeeper. That's just, it's part
Yeah.
of our
How
system,
this? Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so why do you? And if it's really to understand yourself and find your tribe, or, find
Mm-hmm.
your sense of belonging, a self-diagnosis is fine,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't need it for something else. So don't
Right.
don't feel like you need to. And to be quite honest, the gold standard of yesteryear was the ADOS,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
right, the
Yep.
Autism
Yep.
Diagnostic Observation Schedule,
Yep.
which has now gone through its revisions. But man, that thing's coming under fire quite a bit,
Yeah.
actually.
Yep. Yep.
A colleague just shared with me that it underdiagnosed proportionally women to men by 8 to 1. It was like around 8 to 1
Oh,
or
yeah.
something,
Yeah.
something like this. But uh, I think the challenging piece here, and this is what I probably hear from like the neuromajority or neurotypicals, is that the autism diagnosis has evolved
Yeah. Yeah.
in our understanding over
Yep.
time. And so it's not so rigid, if you will, as it was in the past. And like, Dana, I
True.
wonder
Yeah.
if you could maybe highlight kind of some of the defining factors of
Yeah. Yeah.
autism.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as you were speaking, I was thinking I have a list here that I can go through just to give particulars. The first issue is just like you said. So, most of these tests, the RDOS and some of the other ones, are what we
Mhm.
call normed on boys and men. And it's sort of this vicious circle because those are the kids that would get grabbed and noticed as sort of those stereotypical autistic behaviors. So they would be the ones that would be researched on, and then so they were the ones that these measures were developed on, right? So it's easy to miss women or girls because the symptoms or the behaviors or thoughts can be very different, right? So what's happening now is we're getting more feedback from people who are actually autistic, especially women, especially females, saying, "Well, actually, this is the scoop." So, and I think the RDOS has on there, I believe, or the ADOS. The RDOS is the Aspie Quiz. The ADOS is asks about fascination with running water, but I think it says like water out of a faucet. It's very specific. And the first time I took the quiz, I'm like, I don't stand there and stare at the faucet water, right? But I was mesmerized by the ocean. I could sit there for hours and watch the waves come in and the water and that kind of stuff. And so that's just one example of how it could look different in anybody that a single question won't capture because of how it's worded. So that idea of using multiple instruments and doing as much research about these kind of larger categories and then how you fit into them is essential, right? So the autism now in the DSM, because the necessary evil, grabbed and made an umbrella over all of these things where Asperger's used to be under there. What we used to call, we don't anymore, high functioning autism, right? It's a horrible judging label because low functioning. So a lot of those things kind of got put together. So it's why we call it a spectrum. There's a huge variance in how people present at any given point in time who are on the spectrum. The first thing you'll find is there does tend to be a history of it. For those of us that are older, you're not going to have a documented history. So when I was first doing this exploration, I was like, well, my mom or dad weren't diagnosed with this, but they wouldn't have been, they were born in the 30s. They would be diagnosed with this. The more retrospective thinking about it that I have done, my mom had been diagnosed, I think, as borderline. And I was like, oh, and I, all through grad school, I'm like, oh yeah, my mom is borderline. She's borderline. And now I look back at it and I'm like, oh, she was autistic, right? And we know that's one of the most common misdiagnoses in women. Men don't get diagnosed with that. They get diagnosed autistic, and women get diagnosed as borderline personality, right? So family history. What was school like for you? Some kids like me had some learning disabilities early in school, did terribly, and all my report cards show that until I finally figured out how to study and then did well. Or a lot of kids get put in like the gifted classes because they're really good at school if it's a special interest and they know the kind of pattern on how to get good grades. They'll be able to do that. So you can look at your school history. Or your work history. Have you really suffered at work? Have you been in jobs that you really loved and did well in? All those years as a vet tech that I was suited me because medical protocol, you do things the same way every time. I use the same tape, the same catheter, put it on the exact same way. And in fact, that's cherished in medicine. If you can do it the same way every time, it's like, yeah. So I happened to stumble into a vocation that really used those things well, so I did really well at work. There might be other folks that end up in a job that doesn't have those things. It's very unpredictable and really suffer and have a really hard time at work. So school and or work, if you're an adult, to look at how the functioning is in there. I am always reluctant to bring up the social thing because the stigma around we don't know how to socialize. We do. It's more of a sensory overload thing sometimes with social interaction than social interaction per se. If you have someone who doesn't enjoy eye contact, I happen to, but I also learned to do that early in therapy with an amazingly wonderful therapist and learned to trust. And now, to me, it's weird not to look at someone in the eyes. I tend to look around when I'm thinking, but when I'm talking to someone, I'm giving eye contact. A lot of people don't. And people construe that as, oh, they're not good socially, they don't know how to do that, and so on. So do you struggle to keep friends or neurotypical friends? Or I have had clients say, no, I have a whole bunch of friends now because I started going to like Comic-Con and met a bunch of people. I'm like, well, you found your people. So of course, you found your tribe, if that's your thing. Communication issues really are around what we've talked about in other episodes where, especially if you are feeling emotionally overloaded, words and being articulate can sometimes suffer. So you can learn yourself about how you do communication. Are you a wordsmith or not? And when you get overwhelmed, can you articulate yourself or not? Sensitivity. I always tell folks that not everybody, if you're wondering if you're autistic, one of the gold standards that everybody who's autistic has is some sort of sensory sensitivities. People that aren't autistic can have sensory sensitivities, But everybody who's autistic, that's the first thing I start to ask about, because if that's not there,
Yeah.
and you may surprise yourself, you may not think you have these things. Um, I had a little bit of that, and then I'm like, why every Thanksgiving when I'm cooking and I love the cooking smells, I'm so exhausted by the time we eat because I can't let the smell go. I always want to smell it, and it's like it's so intense that by the time dinner comes, I'm exhausted and I don't really enjoy it. It's like, oh, that's a sensory sensitivity, right? You may notice that you like to wear like me, the same types of clothes all the time, or cut tags out of stuff, and the seam on your toe, and some things that other people can relate with, but you may have your own sensory sensitivities that you just become aware of, right? If you think you're autistic, that is there 100%, but you may have to look for what yours are, what fit into that category for you. Needing routines. If you are living a routine filled life and you don't have disruptions to the routine, and you're like, well, I do fine, I don't need routine. But when you really start looking at your life, you're like, wow, I'm pretty routine, and wavering from the routine is hard. Um, Special interests, and we're starting to get some prickliness in the community around
Mhm.
that phrase, because special kind of sounds like, special ed and some of that kind of stuff. But really, that you get interested in something and you deep dive it. You want to know everything about it, right?
Yeah.
And that may or may not become a lifelong interest, but we tend to just go all in really deep, want to know everything about it. Emotional regulation can be hard, especially in kids. Masking, particularly in women, but men can mask too, which is to try to put on that social impression of what you learn about what it's like being neurotypical, and try to do that. But you may notice that you're doing that when you get home, and then you're exhausted that you've been doing that all day. Okay. Let's see. Perceptual issues. A lot of us have clumsiness because we actually don't. Our brain isn't super aware of where we are in space, so we run into things and bump things, and maybe not be good at sports because we don't have that good visual spatial kind of thing. A lot of people will say, "Oh, I fell down a lot as a little kid, or ran into things a lot as a little kid," and little kids do that, but you may still be doing that as an adult. Is sort of another thing you'll really see. Um, and the last note that I have to myself is really trust your knowing. My therapist used to say to me over and over, know what you know. And I'd be
Mhm.
like, oh, know what I. So, really, what she was saying is bring that awareness. You've talked about that a lot. Bring that awareness and validate it for yourself. So, know what you know. Don't let other people tell you, but that's your experience. How would they know? They're not living in you, right? So you'll start to, as you're doing these research on self-diagnosis, you'll start to get aware of these larger categories that I just listed off. And then you'll research the particulars of those that fit for you. And that's what's so great about going to multiple sources and reading different things. I started reading some books that I was like underlining everything in the book, and other books where I was like, wasn't finding myself so much because they were giving examples that didn't fit me. So keep digging, keep looking, look for stuff that makes sense to you, and start to take inventory of those things. Circle them in a book, write them down on a big spreadsheet or something like that. So you really start to get a sense of how you might fit these criteria. And then you're also getting a great therapeutic result that we talked about in the last episode, and that is that self-awareness. You start to become aware more of, oh yeah, that is me. I do have that experience when that happens, right?
Mhm.
And that does fit. Oh, okay. Before I just thought I was crabby, and now I realize it's because, I walked into a store and there's a scent in there I can't stand, or it was just too much, right? So it regardless of whether you self-diagnose or not, even if you get a professional diagnosis, this should still be your task as an autistic person, or someone who loves an autistic person, is learn about it, right? Because the more you can understand about yourself, or the more you can understand about someone you're living with or are friends with, the more you're going to understand them, and that's just going to benefit everybody, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Dana, I feel like this is part of the human condition. This
Mm-hmm.
idea of who am I, right? Identity
Mm-hmm.
formation.
Sure. Yep.
Um, and how important it is. and how formative it can be, at different parts of our life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think for an audience or for anyone that's listening, it's like, again, what is it for?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think people know when they need something.
Yeah.
And you got to trust that when you need it, right? And so even that
Mm-hmm.
idea of, parents will often ask me, "Hey Gwen, when should we share with our kiddo that they have this
Mm-hmm.
diagnosis?"
Oh, uh-huh. Yeah.
Right? And for me, my answer is always, are they curious about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do they
Like,
want to
hey,
know?
do they want to know, or are they wondering, is there some distress because they don't understand why
Mm-hmm.
they are responding to their environment in certain ways, and that
Mm-hmm.
understanding this framework
Yeah.
might help them?
Yeah. Especially now in 2022, because everybody's heard of this now, and there's so much changing in classroom environments around it, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we are just trying, I think culturally, we're trying to promote more inclusivity, diversity, that the
Yeah.
idea, like the more awareness of these things.
Does it
Um,
depend on the age when they ask you that? Like if they've got a really little kid, is the advice different or is it the same? Like how curious are they?
the
Okay.
same. It's the
Okay.
same. I see distress as being a good hallmark of
Yeah.
when we might share something, right?
Oh yeah.
Why, when kiddos are even saying things like, I don't understand why I can't do what someone else does, or I can't
Mm-hmm.
understand why I got to spend a really long time on that.
Yeah.
Oh, I
Yeah.
don't understand why I'm getting separated. I don't understand why, those types of
Yeah.
things.
Even if it's
So,
saying your brain works differently,
yep,
like okay, yeah. Age
yep.
appropriate explanations if
Age
they're
appropriate
cute.
explanations, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that's, it's the time to help someone. They need a framework then to think about
Yeah.
themselves, and we
Yeah.
all do. We all
Yeah.
do. At least those of us that care about or want or are motivated by self-reflection,
Yeah.
self-knowledge, self-understanding. I'm not I don't think everyone is wired in that way. And
Right.
that's not a bad thing. I'm just saying, for those of you that are, that's why you're
Mm-hmm.
listening to this probably episode.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm thinking of, I when I grew up, it was the 60s and 70s were my main school years before college. Um, and when I really came out as autistic and wrote the book and everything, that's kind of hard to hide from a parent. So my mom's been gone for a while, but my dad is still with us. And he, proud father, he's been great. He's read everything I've sent him. Um, but his one of his reactions was, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I wish I would have known." Now, and I don't blame him. We didn't know, they didn't know. Schools didn't know. What we did know is I was in like the remedial reading because I didn't read fast enough and those kinds of things. And I think back and reflecting on it, if had I known then within the cultural lens was then, that would have been scary because it would have been so stigmatized and there wouldn't have been a lot of understanding and I would have been more bullied and marginalized than I was.
Yeah.
So when he says, I wish I would have known, I'm like, you couldn't have. And I don't feel like you, I don't even have to forgive him because it's a non issue for me,
Yeah.
given when I grew up. If it were now, if it were 2022, I would want to know and I would want other kids to know because it would provide that frame and it would normalize it for me. I wouldn't just feel like the stupid kid who isn't trying hard enough. Or I'm not, not paying enough attention to the assignments and doing them on time and so on, which I kind of got a lot of from my parents and my teachers early before I really finally figured out how to study. That would have been a good frame. I wouldn't have internalized shame around that as a little kid.
Mm,
And I think that would have helped. Like, oh, my brain works differently. That I could understand, right? There were things that I had a crossed eye when I was little that I had to have surgically repaired, and it was like that was just a crossed eye, and you have it fixed. You know, if it were framed in that same way, it would have been so formation of self, helpful, right? And
yeah.
so that's why I think it is important now for friends and family not to just say, "Oh yeah, that's that thing you talk about, and we don't have to talk about it," because it really is about acknowledging that person's identity
Yeah.
and giving merit to it, not just recognizing things they might need help on and aren't good at, recognizing things we're really good at. I've shared in here about where I work, where I teach. Amazing group of people that know that I do all of our data tracking, and they're like, you are so good at that, and thank God we have you. Do I not do well at other things? Absolutely. But I work in an environment that's functional enough that they can say that's okay. And coming out as autistic at work has helped. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, that's why you could do that, but you'd suffer. And we have 5 other people that can do that. So let's have them do that. And then let's have you do these other things that you're really good at. And just as humans, we should be doing that anyway. But that's the thing that I'm really excited about for younger people that are being diagnosed now, because they're going to have that. I mean, I'm going
Yeah.
to get choked up as I'm talking about. They're not going to necessarily have to go through those years of self-doubt and self-loathing and why am I different and why can't I do this and I do try and why isn't it working? To have that frame of that diagnosis is going to make all the difference, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is a good, I'm just kind of thinking about when and how I was raised with the idea
Mm-hmm.
of, if you work hard enough, you will get it. And if you don't get it, whatever that it is, that X is,
Mm-hmm.
that X factor, that success, that goal, then you didn't work hard enough.
Yeah.
And this is just not true.
Right.
And this is whenever I'm bumping up against and I'm lucky enough that I don't have to work, I don't have to do my job with a mandatory diagnosis, right? Like I can
Mm-hmm.
work with someone and say, where's the rubber meeting the road? Where are you skidding out? Where is there smoke? Let's just break that down. We
Yeah.
don't that's it. Like we don't have to work with a
Yeah.
label.
Yeah.
However, when someone says to me, I work and I work and I work and I work really, really hard, and the
Mm-hmm.
outcome is so unsatisfactory,
Yeah.
or it's not the same, it's not what I'm expecting. This is a very common for me complaint that
Yeah.
really tips me off a lot of times where I'm
Yeah.
like, we need to really look at like neurologically how things are working for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because effort in, like if someone's listening to this and they're like, oh my gosh, I work so hard. And over time, working really, really hard and not
Mm-hmm.
having the outcomes that you imagine, that leads to like learned helplessness and depression and
Yes,
hopelessness. Like
exactly. Yeah.
that's
Yep.
exactly the path there.
Yep.
And so understanding yourself through different frameworks, especially I think if that results in getting the right supports, getting right
Mm-hmm.
help,
Yeah.
advocacy, accommodations, these
Yep.
types of things, it's important.
Yeah. And I'm proof of flourishing in an environment that was and is a good fit now in my adult life. Like I mentioned, it being in vet med, that fit. Um, Graduate school actually fit for me in terms of I was learning stuff I was interested in, but even the way the learning was presented, and I had learned how to take notes. We've talked about this where your daughter does this too. I wrote everything down. I had color coded pencils or pens, um, and I had a process to study for tests, right?
Yeah.
And that was something that kind of clicked for me when I was in my vet tech program that I really picked up from my older sister who finally taught me how to do that. I'm like, oh, I didn't know. I thought you just read the chapter and then you took the test. Like, no, you have to take notes. And it's like, oh, no one actually sat down with me and told me how to do that. So yeah, the suffering is not having that system figured out for you yet,
Yeah.
right? And working with someone else, it can help you figure out what works for you, organizational strategies, or I still use a paper calendar. It's the one thing I haven't gone online for
Mhm.
because I look at it every day, and sometimes multiple times in a day because it's right there. Whereas I find the electronic version is too out of sight, out of mind. So that's something I know about myself. That's that self-awareness piece. I have to have that for that organizational piece. And that's what working with someone else or learning more about yourself can really help, because you can figure what you need, what would work for you, right?
Yeah, and I really do feel like it really helps for someone else that understands this process to hold the framework,
Yeah, yeah,
to ask the right questions. Like
right.
sometimes you don't know those things unless you're asked questions that help you attune or attend to it.
Yeah, yeah,
And so,
yeah.
and I really feel like that's really sometimes the role of a therapist, right? We're
Mhm.
really asking questions to
Yeah,
drive some sort of understanding and insight. And sometimes we're there to reflect what you might not want to see. I mean,
sure.
it
Yeah.
is that is just part of what we do. It's an art form, not um,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
you
Well,
know.
why did you forget that appointment again? Well, I don't know. Well, did you write it down anywhere? Well, yeah, I wrote it down and I put it on a piece of paper and put it in a drawer. And I'll say, "Do you understand why you didn't why you keep missing appointments?" And I don't do it in a shaming way. Again, flipping it to that sense of efficacy
Mhm.
to you getting choice. If you do it in a way that you can get in your routine, now you again are in the driver's seat. If you're going to look at your calendar every day and see what you have in store for you, for I have a week at a glance. I don't recommend people have one day on a page, because unless you're turning the pages, you don't see what's coming. So
Yeah.
it's those literal sort of nuts and bolts things around you understanding not your diagnosis, as where the episode will be titled, right? It's about what goes into that diagnosis. What are these things that I listed off that are autism? And then what do you need to learn about those things that pertain to you specifically, so that you can do yourself differently? So for
Yeah.
me, it was like something like I have 6 of these black sweaters, and other people don't know that I'm not wearing the same sweater every day, but this works for me with what I've learned about myself, right? It might not work for someone else. You really have to get those broader categories of the diagnosis and figure out for yourself what your autistic picture looks like, right?
Yep.
And
What's your
once you,
brand? What's your
what's your
brand of
brand?
autism?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a question they'll ask my clients, like, "What's your brand?"
Oh, cool.
Or I
Yeah,
might say, "Choose 3 adjectives, but you may
yeah.
only choose 3." Like, let's just like
Ah,
and that really helps to especially if I've got someone who has a good command of the language, that's good. I
mhm.
might not do that. I mean, I don't do
Try
it with
to zero
everybody.
them in on it. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, because they don't know where to look.
yeah. Right.
And it's not because they're not trying to look, they're just overwhelmed. There's not a path. We
Mhm,
talked
mhm,
about that with disruption in our last episode, that
mhm,
understanding the path is a very grounding,
mhm.
regulating
Yeah,
kind of thing. It's kind of like when someone's overwhelmed and they immediately feel better when it gets written down and sorted.
yeah, yeah.
Right? Like, my daughter just said that to me as she's starting high school, and she's a
Mm,
paper planner as well, and she's like, I need if I put it down and I can see it, and when it's due, I feel much better, and it's like I keep
yeah.
saying to her, your brain is not meant to keep all the little details, it's meant to think.
Right,
It's really
right.
meant to think and do things with. That stuff needs to get out of your head. It's
Yeah.
muddying things up. Just put it down. But that causes people anxiety, especially if they want to do good and be good, right? Like,
Right,
they
right.
don't want to miss that stuff
Yeah,
because they want to do good. And
yeah,
so I love this, like, know what you know. And this is kind of going back to that know your brand. And if you don't know your
yeah,
brand, then work on your brand.
yeah,
What is your elevator pitch?
yeah,
About
yeah.
yourself.
That's right. Yeah, figure out your brand, figure out your systems, things that you have to have that work for you.
Yep.
And then little things that are going to trickle through that net. What are your other nets then to catch those other things, right? And you actually can figure out ways that will do that for you. And then wonderfully, you'll start to be able to not, not just function better, but be less stressed about it, right?
Oh
Like,
yeah.
oh, I got this. I have it written down. It's all good. To the point where when I have students that miss due dates, I'm like, how does that, what? How did that even happen? I'm not very forgiving. I'm like, no, I'm not giving you credit. It's the test. It's everywhere. It's in the syllabus. You got an email about it. You've missed the test. Too bad for you. So I've like gone the other way. Like I'm not forgiving at all. Like how you need to write this down.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you had the information, like, you're
Yeah, yeah.
responsible for what you can control. I mean, I
Right.
think that's like the idea, right? Like,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not going to hold you responsible for something you can't control,
Yeah.
but we
Yeah.
sure are going to hold you responsible for something you can control.
Yeah.
And,
I wouldn't do that to a 5-year-old in kindergarten,
of
but to a
course not.
20-some
Right.
grad student, oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
it's
you got
time.
you
Yeah.
had some decades on that to figure
Uh-huh.
that one out. Yeah, yeah, for sure, for
Yeah. Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
I think anyone, kind of back to our original topic of our episode today,
Yeah.
and that is, self-diagnosis or formal diagnosis, is a framework or a process by which you understand yourself better.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you don't need a formal diagnosis, there's no
Hmm.
need to go in that direction, especially when you might not have access, right? You were just saying
Hmm.
there's a 3-year wait list
Yes.
for some.
Yeah.
You may
That's
not
right.
have access. You don't need to wait that long, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, our professional measures have to be rigid in order to
Hmm.
maintain, quote unquote, I'll say that for our listening audience only,
Yeah.
a quality,
Yeah.
a criterion for
Yep.
diagnosis. But in doing so, we can be exclusive
Hmm. Hmm.
to people where in a very nuanced diagnosis.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, even if you do get a professional or formal diagnosis, you should still keep, in a way, self-diagnosing by exploring and learning more about yourself, for sure.
Always,
Yeah.
always. That's this is where knowledge is power. What is that?
Oh yeah.
What was that old G.I. Joe?
GI
What
Joe said knowledge is power.
who said that? Oh my gosh. If you're listening to this, if the audience is listening, like leave it in the comments. What
I
is
want to
that?
say someone like Winston Churchill or something, someone
No,
more
it's like
important than GI
G.I.
Joe.
Joe
Yeah.
used to have this
Oh.
phrase.
Ah.
Maybe I'm wrong. I might be
Okay.
totally wrong on this. Anyway, if you're listening to this and you can save me, please do in the comments below.
Yeah, you can't know what you don't know, or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. That's
But
great.
anyway, so I think our hope here is I'm hoping that our dialogue and our conversation are,
Hmm.
it's empowering for you if you're listening. Dana gave like 10, like really 10 high level kinds
Hmm.
of things to
Hmm.
really, really think about. And it's okay, what resonates with you, go through it. And I
Hmm.
really like this idea of resonation. Like if it's resonating with you, that means it's resonating with your internal world. And we really
Right.
encourage you to like spotlight your internal world and not what you want to look like in the external world. Not,
That's right.
we
Yeah.
stay away from
Yeah.
masks. Even though we understand that masks can be functional in their own way and they serve a
Yeah. Yeah.
purpose, but only when
Hmm.
they serve a purpose do we use them.
Right.
Um, if you are listening to this and you feel so inclined, comment below. What is the process of self-diagnosis? Have you
Hmm.
self-diagnosed or gone through formal diagnosis? What has that been like for you? How can you help our community in
Yeah.
this? And I'll always plug this. If you like what you're hearing and this was helpful for you, please like, subscribe, and comment to this video if you're on YouTube. And if you're in audio, please comment and like our channel or this episode. That really helps Dana and I continue to do this because we want to continue doing this. It's
Yeah.
fun for Dana and I, and we believe that we're doing something for our community that we have
Hmm.
not seen before, and that's why we wanted to create this space. So anyway, for all of you guys out there, thank you for being here.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.